Hello, this is Jack Vanderpool, Team Lead for the SCAP Compliance Checker, and in this video I'm going to be doing an introduction to the graphical user interface of the SCC application to show you the basic features for performing local scans. Remote scanning for Windows and Unix and Cisco will be in subsequent videos. This is the third in a series of videos to help our users get up to speed with SCC. In this demonstration I'll be using Windows, but the basic functionality works the same across platforms. So if you're running it on Red Hat or Ubuntu or Mac, most of the features will be the same. In this example, I'm going to be double-clicking on an icon on the desktop, but you could be using your Start menu as well. And the first thing to notice is going to be the user account control, and to make sure that the verified publisher is what we have listed here, cs.nywick-atlantic.001. This is to ensure that the application has not been republished or modified by someone other than our development team. While it's launching, if you don't have the DoD root certs installed, you might notice that it is listed as unknown. They can be obtained from DISA and is documented in the SCC User Manual FAQ. So here's the basic interface of SCC. On the left-hand side, we have some information about scanning, and in the middle we have content, and on the right we have content details. For a first-time user, really the only thing you need to do a local scan is to simply leave everything as the default and click Start Scan. So what's going to happen here is SCC is going through all of the enabled content and determining which ones are applicable. There are a few applicability checks in each content piece so that the entire content stream doesn't need to be performed against it and won't create reports or anything. So you can leave content enabled and kind of blast it out. It will take a little bit longer to scan because it's got to do those little bit of precursor things, but for the most part you can leave most things enabled and just click Scan. The basic default installation of SCC contains what we think are the most common configuration settings. We'll be digging into the more details of how to change all of that as we go through this demonstration. Right now we're going to be creating HTML reports will be the default, and there'll be some XML files, and the results will be in your home user directory. And here's a scan. I will admit I did disable, actually I uninstalled one piece of content that I know to take a long time because it scans the entire hard drive looking for certain files. When we do content updating later, we'll pull that one back in. So if we look at the screen, we can see that we had 0 errors, 0 warnings. It created a summary report, and it tells us exactly where the files are. Those are useful if you want to go browse around the file system on your own. But you can also view all of the stuff within the SCC application itself. This is especially useful on Linux variants, where if you try to launch a web browser from SCC, it's not allowed as a root and things like that. So most of the capabilities are built right in. So we'll dive right into looking at what SCC results look like now. So the scan is complete of my local computer. And obviously I have more than one scan. I've been playing around. This is my test system. At the top we'll see how many sessions I have and how many files and the file size. And then the topmost session will be the most recent, and it shows me that I had one host that was scanned, 5 content streams. Of all of those that were enabled, 5 were applicable, and I get a min and a max compliance. I said this is not a production system, this is just a test box, so it'll be kind of hit or miss on compliance. Certain things will be compliant, certain things won't. As we go down to the left bottom quadrant here, we can see the host name, and we can see the content streams that were applicable. This is a Windows 10 host. So we have the STIG, the Windows 10 STIG, the Defender Firewall, or Defender Antivirus, the Firewall. I have Firefox installed on here, and the IE11. Actually, let's go back up to the top. So if we want to do, if we wanted to open the directory, let's say we wanted to actually view where the files were at in the file system, we could right-click on any of the sessions up here and click Open Directory, and it'll pop open a Windows Explorer interface, so you can see the files there. We could also delete the selected session, or we could delete all. We can also open a summary viewer. So there's lots of things we can do up here. For the most part, I just wanted to show you that there's a right-click menu. And in the bottom right, where the reports live, and the XML, and if we had error logs or debug logs, there'd be a third tab for logs. The all settings, if I double click on it, by default, it will just open up in a kind of pseudo web browser that is only designed to view our files. So this is, you can do some searching in here. So if I wanted to look for a certain thing, I could search things. We can scroll down through. I chose a poorly configured one to start with. Maybe I should go with Windows 10. So on this system, I'm 85.31% compliant. That's just a basic mathematical comparison of passes versus fails. We'll see some basic information about my system. We'll drill into all the details of how these reports work and how to understand them more in a subsequent video. This is just an intro. So we have some stuff about the content, and then we have some results, pass and fails. And if we scroll down to one of these, we'll see a whole bunch of information about the checks and the content. And all of this text, with the exception of the collected items, these are all things that are come directly from the content. So SCC doesn't have anything hard-coded into it. These are all read in from XML content, and then results are gathered and then kind of aggregated together. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but if we look at the XML, so like the XCCDF results, we can look at that as well. So these are SCAP validated results, and these can be fed into other tools like Stig Viewer, etc. A lot of not exactly human readable stuff in there, but it's also interoperable with lots of other tools. So there's the basic gist of the session viewer within SCC. If I did want to, say I don't like the interface of our application, I could open in a default file viewer. So on this one, it'll pop open a Firefox interface. So I can do the same thing in Firefox or Chrome or whatever my default browser is. We'll close that. Let's see here. So if I go back to the main interface, I'll go back to Show Content. So the Choose Content window on the left-hand side, we're going to leave it as local scan, but this is where you would select if you wanted to do a remote scan or a Cisco iOS scan. And depending if you're on Linux, you won't see Windows remote scanning. We can scan from Windows to Linux and Mac and Cisco, and we can scan from Linux to Linux and from Linux to Cisco, but no scanning backward to Windows from any Unix variant. And we can see the number of content streams I have enabled here. And then we'll probably just do, actually I'll show you this. So if we look at any of these content streams, you can see these details over on the right-hand side. And this can be where we learn about choosing profiles. So all of this, like I said, is directly from the content. These are all just little bits and pieces of data that comes from the Stig benchmarks. So I can go through and choose a different profile if I want. Let's say the system is classified as a Mac 3 public. Sure. So that might change which checks are performed if that content is performed. And we can also do it if I right-click in the content window out here. I can actually do a set all profiles. So if I want to set all the profiles, so if I know my infrastructure that I'm scanning is Mac 2 classified, I can set them all to Mac 2 classified and save. And then we can go back through and look, and each one of those has now been set to Mac 2 classified. We don't need to do them one by one. You can also, on the right-click menu, we could clear all or select all. And we can also delete selected content, individual stream, or delete all. And over on the right-hand side here too, there's some pros reports, tailoring, and deviations. Pros reports, I'll create one. These are really just kind of almost like the Stig manual, but this is the data that's in the benchmark before we perform a scan. So I can go look at that in a web browser and essentially go see what is going to be performed. So I can go see exactly what all the tests are and read the pros and the fixed text and everything about it. It's really the SCC reports minus the results. Tailoring and deviations are going to take a bit more time to talk about. We will talk about those in a different video. I think from the main interface, I'm going to do a check for content updates. There's a new feature in SCC 5.4 and going forward, depending if you have internet connectivity. We're going to assume you do at this point. We will talk about the configuration options of it later, but I'm just going to play around. So right now, I went out and queried a DISA GitHub repository, which is the official one from DISA. And we see a bunch of new content streams here, and we see some updated ones. The updated ones are ones where the benchmark ID, so like Google, Chrome, current Windows, and Mozilla Firefox Windows and IE11 STIG, those were installed, and we can see the versions here. And this installation, I will admit, I've modified so I would have something to update, because right now the 5.4 will have all of the latest content included in it. This is more for educational. And you'll see that the ones that are updated are automatically enabled and they're selected, so you can just click install. The ones that are new, it really depends on your environment and what you're scanning. Most of these are going to be like, these are Linux and Solaris, and unless you're doing remote Unix scanning, not all that useful. But it could be some new application, so we didn't want to prevent them from being viewed. The one that I did remove from installation for my scans to save time was the .NET Framework. So I will take that one and all the updated content and try installing this. And it takes a little while, not extremely slow. So it's going and downloading them, doing a SHA 3 256 checksum, and then install those 4 content streams. And we can go and we can click close. And then we can see that based on the default configuration settings, there's a new feature in SCC 5.4 as well. So the Google Chrome current, the one I have highlighted here, version 2 Rev 2, is newer than the version 1.14 that was in there. So SCC automatically disabled the old content. Same thing with IE and with Firefox. So the old versions that were installed were disabled, so the next time I scan, those won't be performed by default. There's other options that we could go into, that we'll go into soon, to actually delete the content or archive it. And I think that's really it for the main menu at this point. We'll go into the options, show options. And there's a lot of stuff in here, more than most people want. There's a few settings we're going to touch on more than anything else, but a lot of these things, the defaults are fine, and with subsequent versions we might actually remove some of the options just to make it easier to use. So on the scanning options page, the most commonly changed option, specifically if you were running on CentOS or some Linux variant that is not officially matching the STIG, there's this run all content regardless of applicability. So that will cause every piece of content to be performed regardless of whether or not it really should be performed. But so like for CentOS 7, the rel 7 content is for the most part applicable. So this will allow the content to run without have to be manually modified. The rest of these options, there's some interoperability things in here. The oval processing options, for the most part, you don't need to know much about. We'll leave them as default. The one item to note here, the process oval access token by user right is useful if you're scanning a large domain controller and has many, many users and groups. SCC will actually print a warning if you scan a domain controller to give you a heads up that you might want to do this. It's not officially sanctioned in SCAP, but in our testing and validation, we've proven that the end result is equivalent, but it also goes a lot faster and the results become a lot smaller. So might be useful on large domain controllers. WMI scanning stuff and SSH, we'll talk about this probably when we go into the remote scanning, so I'm going to skip over that. Content options. I alluded to this earlier, but when installing newer versions of existing SCAP content, there's an option here to do nothing. You can leave it alone and leave the content as is, or you can disable it, which was the default. You can also archive it to a different directory, or you can delete it. We'll just leave it as disable. We'll leave that as is. SCAP or schema validation. It's wise to do schema validation on installation of content just to make sure that the content you're pulling down doesn't have any blatant flaws in it. We don't need to, and we'll actually cache that information along with a checksum of the file. So the second option here, perform schema validation on input files before scanning, isn't entirely needed. Perform XML schema validation on output files, that's really more for development purposes. We have that one enabled by default except for final builds. That's to make sure that our tool is creating SCAP compliant results. Digital signature, perform digital signature before scanning. If there happens to be a digital signature, which there isn't currently any from DISA, then we'll make sure that the checksums match before performing a scan, and then we'll cache that result. So we'll only do it once unless the files are modified. Let's see here. That's really it for intro. I don't want to dig into too many details here. Reports. Now this is something you might want to play around with, even at an intro level here. Once you start looking at the reports, you'll determine which ones you think are useful, and that's hard to know. If you just want to see the failures, you can turn off the all settings reports. Or if you don't want to have separate reports, you can just do the all settings. If you want to view things in text, obviously put them in text, skip HTML. And the XML results, it really depends what you plan to do after SCC is done scanning. So all of these things are really for if you want to hand the results over to another system outside of SCC. The most common is the XCCDF results. Those can go into the STIG viewer and other tools. Oval results, not as common. And NIST reports, some of these we have enabled right now because it's kind of mandated by SCAP, but you can turn some of these off and it won't impact the overall results for most purposes. And you'll have fewer files and less data. And there's a summary viewer thing here. This is kind of legacy from before we had a built-in session viewer in SCC. This creates a little HTML document in the root of the results directory for that session so that you can have hyperlinks to find all the files and reports. It can be turned on, it can be turned off. It's nothing very large or time-consuming. And then the scan session information here. So this is save scan session information. If you don't do this, the view results stuff will not exist. And then here is where if you want to have your default file viewer, so let's say you have Notepad++ on Windows, or if you want to view the reports in Chrome or IE, you can uncheck this, and then by default, SCC will try to use whatever the operating system default is. Logging options, not a lot here, and for the most part, these can be left alone. If you have troubles with some results not being accurate or other errors, when we work with end users, we quite frequently tell them to turn on debug logs. They're going to create a lot of data, so I would not leave them enabled by default or by when you scan, unless you're troubleshooting something. And the verbose trace level debug, that's that plus a lot more. You can guarantee you're going to have gigs of data being generated. So those, for the most part, you want to leave alone. Okay, on to output options. There's a lot of data here. Don't let it scare you too much. Most of these you can just leave as is unless you have some particular reason to change the way SCC puts data. The first one might be useful if you are on a multi-user computer and you want to have unique preferences of SCC. You can change that one to be your user home directory. Second option is similar to the configuration data in the first one, but this is really the sensitive stuff. So we've segregated those so that we really think that your passwords and things related to security should be in your home directory, but you can put it somewhere else if you desire. The logs and results, once again, we go to a user's home directory, and you can see where it's going to be. It's dynamically set on application load. If you do choose a custom directory and want to put it on a share, putting it to a map share is going to be problematic if completely not functional, because for the most part, the admin version of your user doesn't have the same map drives. So unless you map the drives beforehand as your administrator, they're not going to be available. But you can use the UNC path server //server/share. And the next section of things here is really just choosing what directory structure and what you want the files to look like. Until you play around with this, you can leave these all alone. And the last option is having SCC lock down the permissions on the results and the logs to be essentially your user and the administrators group on Windows. SSH option, this is like SSH file transfer. Not a very frequently used feature of SCC, but if you're scripting SCC, you can put in credentials to put the files in a shared SFTP directory. We won't touch too much on this, but just documentation is there, and it's really, if you have a server and credentials and you want to put results together, you can do that. Okay, update options. This is where you can change some of the new functionality in SCC, where it can go connect to the internet and download content and or check to see if SCC is up to date. The first section is about proxy connections, or HTTP connections, but primarily proxy. So if your web browser can connect to the internet, the odds are you can probably use your system proxy and have it work. If you need to do some custom proxy configuration, you can enter it here, just like you would with some of the web browser applications. But if you already have it configured in Windows, then just leave it as system proxy. Application updates. None of these are enabled by default, by the way, so we don't automatically go phone home or go do anything. But should you want to automatically check every few days to see if your installation of SCC is up to date, you can do so. There's just a little XML file out on a GitHub repository owned by DISA that we go query. It doesn't actually update the application. It's really just letting you know that you are current, and I'll give you a download link to go obtain a newer version if and when it's available. With content updates, we do the same thing. You could periodically go check for updates, and it'll let you know. And you can also specify the content repository. There's a whole section in the FAQ on how to create your own offline repository. I won't go into too much details here because it would take too long, but you could clone the content that's out on DISA's cyber.mil page and also copy this XML file and make your own offline repository, and then you could point your installation of SCC at it if you have an isolated enclave and still want to do content updates. From there, we'll click Save, and we'll come back and touch on just some of the high-level file options. We've touched on, let's see what's here, File. So in case you just want to restore everything back to default, you can click Restore Default Options. You can also save off your options as just as an archive or load in a previously saved version. Options we touched on, Results. View results is kind of repetitive to the session viewer, but it's the old school, it's just that. And then we can do the Open Session Directory, which is just the directory that has the results in it. View application logs. So here is, I had debug on in a previous log, so in a previous scan. So here is a debug log output. Post-scan report generation. This one we'll talk about later. This is once again a very seldom used feature that aggregates results into a summary format. The help menu itself, you can open up a help file, basically our user manual. Searchable, indexed, you can look for wherever you want there. The help is just a PDF version of that. You have release notes that show what's changed. And you have the check for content update, check for SCC apt updates. We didn't do it before, so I'll do it now. Hey, we're up to date, version 5.4. And we have an end user license, which you also had to agree when you did the installation. And third-party licenses, this is new. We've documented all of the open source and third-party proprietary licenses that are included with SCC. So that's just there as FYI. And then the About page. So this tells the version of the application, you get a build number, so making sure exactly what version you're running if you need tech support. All of the specifications and SCAP stuff that we support, along with our tech support email and our website. New website as of very recently too, much shorter and easier to view. So, and that is pretty much it for SCC intro. I hope you found this useful, and stay tuned for further episodes. Thank you very much for your time.